Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
The woods of southeast Michigan. When I was very young, from the ages of 5 through 12, my two brothers, one a year older and the other 2 years younger than me, and I would play in the woods our neighborhood was built in the middle of. There was a lot of scary shit out there in those woods. I never put all of the pieces together into one larger picture until a couple of months ago, while talking to my sister about the story that has maps and boxes in it. She's 7 years younger than me, so she wasn't along for most of this stuff. For the record, as the title says, we live in southeast Michigan. I've got a pack of smokes and a pot of coffee and nothing better to do right now, so if anyone is reading, I guess it's time to remember some stuff. When we were little, my brothers and I, along with a number of neighborhood children, were obsessed with the woods. We did all of those awesome little boy things, like making maps and building forts and climbing trees. For the first couple of years, there were only a few houses in the neighborhood. The three of us mostly just played together. We were inseparable back then. The first time things got weird, we found an old pickup truck crashed against a tree deep in the woods. Our township is pretty old, and the place where our neighborhood resides had at one point been a major dumping ground and a couple of local businesses. I think it was back in the 20s or 30s or so, from what I recall. The truck itself had a lot of things in it, including some suspicious fibers like decayed clothing and a terrible odor. We told our dad and he went out the next day. We weren't allowed in that part of the woods anymore, and yet we went all the time anyways. A little while later, a buddy down the street and I started exploring downriver from there. We found, over the next several months, dozens of boxes, all of them containing mundane items. One of them had a crapload of old Penthouse magazines in it. We said we'd come back later with flashlights and get them. When we came back, they were gone. Now that sounds mundane, but it becomes relevant later. Now there was some strange wildlife in this area. I always thought I was crazy, but it turns out that yes, there are wild peacocks running about in my old neighborhood. I have no idea how that happened, but those aren't the creatures I dream about all these years later. No, that would be the dogs. We had a pack of wild dogs running about, big, muscular wild dogs that couldn't be caught. They had a leader, an alpha if you will, who was bigger and meaner looking than the rest. He was solid white with red eyes, which I now know means he was albino in all likelihood. They would watch us play, and when we noticed, we would climb trees and wait till they lost interest to go kill a raccoon or something. Then one day, there was another kind of animal down there watching us in the tree with them, a dirty old man with a big scraggly beard and jet black hair. He would be sighted about the neighborhood, but the cops couldn't or wouldn't do anything about it. My dad chased him off of our lawn with his .22 a couple of times. There was a park at the end of our neighborhood. Nothing special, just a fake beach with a couple of benches and a swing set. It was where the river bent around and hit another subdivision's backside. We would spend all summer fishing on that strip of gravelly sand every year. The woods had a trail in them that led to that other neighborhood, and sometimes we went down it for kicks. There were a lot of old, weird structures built off the trail, like sheds made of packing pallets and 100-year-old tree forts. We were young adventure lads, so we were constantly snooping. God, I have no idea how we weren't all murdered by the end of things. I remember one time, my older brother decided he'd go for a swim a little up the river from where I was fishing. He got down to his underwear and just jumped in. A few minutes later, he's shouting and I'm running for him. He's hurriedly dressing. I look out. There was a little island-like spot in the middle of that part of the river covered in cattails, and standing amid them was some guy. I could only see the beard, but like I said, things begin to come together when you reflect years later. So now we hit the part where I describe myself a little bit. I'm of average build, haven't ever been terribly handsome, and have had sleeping problems my whole life. I would sneak out of the house a lot late at night and go for little strolls around the neighborhood and the woods surrounding them. Which is funny, because I'm terrified of open blinds after dark. I'm not afraid of the dark, just windows people can stare at me through. That's exactly what happened one night. My bedroom was on the second floor of the house, next to my little brother's. I had forgotten to close the blinds before dusk one night and got up to shut them. I had a habit of looking down when I had to do that out of paranoia. This time, the blinds got stuck. When I looked up to fix them, there he was with his face against the glass. The man with the beard. I screamed, and my dad came running and my mom called the cops. My little brother woke up because he stomped off across the roof and jumped. It was a rainy day and my yard tended to turn to soup due to septic issues. So when my dad found the splatter from him landing and his footprints, he was convinced. I didn't go outside at night for years after that. I guess I bring up my looks because I looked a lot worse when I was younger. I sometimes wonder why this guy had such an interest in us, but like I said, things get a lot clearer with time. He was clearly some kind of Minecraft YouTuber or something, and probably homeless. I have always had this recurring dream of me running through the woods with those dogs, which, believe it or not, is also an actual memory. I woke up to that a couple of times. See my first post? Shit gets a little weird and fuzzy for me around this period, which was when I was something like 8. I had a sleepwalking issue. I still do, so had is the wrong word. I would wake up covered in mud all the time. It got so bad my parents started deadbolting my door and windows. Now, I also understand it was because of that guy. All of our rooms were similar and my parents got a motion sensor to monitor me and my sleepwalking problem. One night I woke up in the woods being carried. We weren't far, I could see my neighbor's house. I screamed like I've never screamed in my entire life and it startled him. He dropped me. I'd probably be dead if not for that. I started sharing a bedroom with my little brother, and my older brother was moved upstairs into my old room. Now, at this point, the cops were always at our house and always in our neighborhood. We lived in a quiet suburb during the early 90s, so this sort of thing was largely unheard of around our area. It was big news around town. So one day, my brothers and I are clearing weeds to build a structure back in a different part of the woods. We all had favored weapons that we'd found and claimed were for defense, but we really only used them to whack weeds out of our way. The dogs and us were on friendly terms by then. My little brother is whacking weeds next to me with his weapon of choice. A 2x4 with a bunch of nails in one end he found in a drainage ditch when he suddenly goes stiff and pale. I ask what's wrong and he just snaps at me to not move. My little brother's an engineer now, and he's absurdly good at everything he does. He holds his board up by my face, pushing me suddenly, and there's a loud bang. I'm confused. He turns it around and there's a hole from a bullet in it. He points, and there off in the distance a guy is running away. I ask where our brother is, and he laughs and points. He's running across the field after the guy screaming, a pitchfork in his hand. We lost sight of the dude a neighborhood over. Now, my little sister was very young at this point. My parents watched her like hawks because weird shit was starting to go down when she was an infant. One night, my dad just goes running past my bedroom in his underwear, baseball bat in hand, and goes charging out the front door. It's one of the only times I've ever heard him swearing. From what my mom says, the guy was peeking through the slightly cracked blinds at my sleeping baby sister. I never let her go anywhere out of my sight when she got old enough to play with us, and I only told her about some of this stuff very recently. Now that neighborhood buddy from earlier and we got bold. We went where we'd seen the boxes again, even though we weren't supposed to. There was this weird dirt path off by the dirt road on that end of the neighborhood that went nowhere. We looked around and eventually found a steel drum with stuff from a fire made of clothing and toys surrounded by mattresses. We were kind of freaked at first. Then we saw the boxes. Now I know they were the same boxes because I looked inside. I recognized the magazines. We came back later that night. Now when we returned, we did so with flashlights and backpacks and little fishing utility knives. We weren't very smart. We approached with our flashlights off as we could see the fire burning and hid behind some brush. There were a bunch of guys who all looked similarly disheveled in stereotypical hobo fashion. They were drinking and singing in some foreign language. I remember none of the words, or even anything close, so I'll likely never know what language they were using. We didn't stick around long. I got yelled at for being out that late, and rightly so. It was stupid of me. Now, I do believe paranormal things have happened around me, whether that's stupid or not. However, I believe this was just a case of some weird homeless men living in the woods or something. Were there weird little fetishes made of twigs all over the woods? Yes. Does that make me think they were some sort of cult? No. I just wanted to state that I think this was just creepy guys, nothing extra special.
So at what point does a rational couple with several children decide, time to move?
That sounds like a good idea, but frankly, we couldn't afford to. That may seem dumb to some of you, but in a country where not even healthcare is something most families can afford, what makes you think we could just leave? I wish. They weren't the best parents all of the time, but goddamn do I respect my parents and their massive amounts of hard work and dedication and love. Flash forward a year or so, we decided to get a little bit wacky in our fortress design because someone or a few somebodies started wrecking them up. We dug a humongous pit in the ground, something like 10 by 8 feet that was a good 6 feet deep, and put a bunch of scrap wood supported by posts over it and a tarp, then buried it. We made this really cool hatch that we grew grass onto to hide it, and now we had a secret bunker. We had fun in that fort all summer long. One afternoon late in summer, both of my brothers just want to play Super Nintendo, so I decide I'll go it alone just to put some new stuff I'd found in the fortress. I'm just down the street when I start hearing a loud thwacking noise over and over again. I decided to keep my distance and get out the toy binoculars I was going to stash back there. I was bringing tools and scraps of wood I'd found. I couldn't get a good look through the tree line. Then I heard a loud boom. I didn't go back there that day, but the next day my brothers and I went to our fortress. Someone had cut a huge tree down right onto it, destroying it. We picked a new spot in the woods because now we couldn't go back there as our parents had somehow found out. This was when I was 10 or so, and shortly before fort stopped being our thing. I grabbed up some old bologna from the trash to feed the dogs and headed off into the woods. We had started building bike trails with jumps and ramps back by our latest fortress, which should have probably finished what the bearded man started and killed us all. God, we were such idiot children. Anyways, I went back to the bike trail to see what was up today, and my older brother was already there. He looked upset. I followed him back because he wouldn't tell me what was up. When we got back there was stuff written in red paint all over the place on our stuff and the trees. I said something like, "Damn kids from the other neighborhood painting up our stuff." My older brother pointed out that there were flies all over the paint. It wasn't paint, it was blood. I didn't believe him until he walked with me up to where our fortress had been. One of the wild dogs was down in the pit, his throat slit. Now this is the summer where Fort stopped being cool because of that last bit. We stopped going into the woods. We should have years earlier, but you know how dumb children can be. We felt like nothing could happen to us. We switched things up and went fishing in the park a lot more. A couple of houses were right across the river, and we only went in the early afternoon, so we felt pretty safe. We avoided the trails and that part where the river bends and that island was. My granny got even more concerned and begged our parents to find a way to move. They said they couldn't without significant financial help, which nobody could give. Besides, my father had built that house. I think the guy got smart, because we didn't see him for the rest of the summer and quickly forgot everything about all of the previous events, like I said. Idiot children. I was at the park fishing with my sister one afternoon, and as I looked down into my tackle box to change lures, she made a little yelp. I looked up, and she was hiding behind me. I asked her what had happened, like had she had a bug bite her or something, and she just shook her head. She didn't speak much when she was little for some reason. Now she talks so much it gets grating at times. I crouched down and saw she was crying, so I packed up our stuff and we headed home. She said she'd seen some guy in the tree line staring at me, and I decided I didn't want to go into the park anymore. I started being an indoors kind of boy, got into magic cards and D&D, and we'd all been reading comics and playing video games for forever anyways, so I guess we finally smarted up. No more adventures for a few years and only a couple of sightings around our yard of Mr. Beardy Face. Flash forward a good 8 years and only a few sightings, and we come to me getting into a lot of trouble. I had been doing drugs for a bit a couple of years prior, but had been clean for a good year at that point. I woke up one night from the dream about the dogs, which I hadn't had in years, and I was in the woods by the park. Thankfully, I was fully clothed and on my feet. I must have been sleepwalking again. I got my bearings for a bit and then I heard it. The laughing. Not just one voice either. Muscle memory kicked in. I'd been down the trails in these woods 1,000 times, and I was almost to the other neighborhood, where a good friend who had helped me get clean lived. She knew about the man in the woods, said she'd seen him, although I can't prove that one way or the other, and her back door was always open for me because I sleepwalked to her house all the time. I booked it. I looked back and there was the guy. He was chasing me. I ran straight through a bramble because I knew it would shave time off and delay him, and got cut up by it. But he didn't follow, just screamed and got tangled up. The woods ended in a huge park with a soccer field in my pal's neighborhood, and when I got to that field, I just screamed and ran across it with all of what I had left. There was a single streetlight opposite the park, and I stood in that circle of light as houses' lights clicked on. I looked back and saw him standing in the tree line, and he tipped his hood up and just walked back into the woods. I didn't stick around even though an old lady was yelling at me to stop, and proceeded to have a mental breakdown at my buddy's house. Now couple that last part about multiple voices laughing with the part about the weird campsite from earlier, and I think maybe they all just looked similar enough that it was never just one guy. Or maybe one had taken a particular interest because the last time I saw him was the weirdest one. My parents had gotten divorced when I was in high school, and my dad had moved to Georgia, about 30 minutes west of Atlanta. I got sent to live with him after my complete mental breakdown. I know, 20-year-old guy still living with his folks and all that. I had trouble getting my life together. I moved into an apartment shortly after because I'd gotten my first really serious girlfriend. We lived in an apartment down the road from my dad's place, and I worked at an Arby's on the other end of town. I didn't have a car, but I like walking anyways, so I just walked to and from work all the time. Our apartment complex was the only building on our street, which was 3 miles long. I always knew I was almost home when I saw the traffic light at the top of the hill, which was a mile uphill from our apartment. One night, I got to the top of the hill and felt relieved. It was 1 a.m, and I was tired. I started my second wind jog down the hill and got a bad feeling. The streetlights on our road were almost a quarter of a mile apart, and I stopped under the first one so I could catch my breath and observe my surroundings. I looked back up the hill as I often did and saw the shadow of a man running down the hill. I decided not to figure out what that was all about and booked it for home. A car swerved and almost hit me, because at that point I was trying to flag it down as it was the only car I'd seen. I looked back, hearing tires squeal. They almost hit the guy, and he was right under the light I'd been under. It was him. He gave me that same hood tip and just sauntered into the swamp by the road. I ran home so fast, and then I never saw him again. Thanks for reading my weird story, guys and gals. If anyone's got questions, I'll be up a little longer. I guess I also forgot to mention that the last sighting was when I was 20. I'm 28 now. I either got too old for him or he lost interest. Thank God for that.
Bumping for interest. Any other weird, possibly related, but maybe not things? Any other weird things that you forgot when you were telling the story?
Okay, so I remembered a couple of details that escaped me earlier. The man was seen by several of my neighbors over the years, if I didn't mention it, and still he was somehow never apprehended. Or if he was released pretty quickly and easily. I can't confirm which, I don't think, although I'm researching the matter. I remember a detail about those tunnels I mentioned. A neighbor kid fell down one right in front of me. I have no idea how I forgot about that. He scrambled out and never wanted to talk about it. I never looked down it again. I keep wanting to mention my hometown by name, which is hard to not do, but I don't want anybody to figure out where this was and go into the woods looking and get hurt. I'm glad nobody has asked that I do that. I won't. I told a story earlier in the week that a few people on here seemed to like, and in my thread I promised I'd tell a few of the other weird stories when I had some time. I've had a lot of strange things happen to me in my life, some of them completely explainable but still ridiculously ridiculous, and some of them not so explainable. This one falls into the latter category. As the title implies, this story is about my late grandfather, and the fact that I'm not so sure the last few years of his time with our family was really him. I really hope I'm wrong. I really don't want to even think about what this story means for him, for us as a family, and for the world at large if it means what I think it means. When I was a young boy, I spent a good deal of every summer with my paternal grandparents. They lived deep into the country, where the houses are miles apart and the woods go on forever. I loved it there, because I only really saw them over summer break due to them going to Florida every year when it started to get cold. My grandfather was half Blackfoot, and he often told stories his mother had handed down to him while we walked through the woods. It was from him that I first heard about what is often referred to as skinwalkers on here. I have always had very strange dreams, and I often attribute it to the fact that I don't sleep very much, and vice versa. Every few months for my entire life, I have had a dream about my grandfather standing just in the tree line by where his backyard met the woods, 2 large bucks standing slightly behind him as he beckons me into the woods. It's odd that it started when I was young and was ultimately the very last time I saw him years later. Now I'm getting ahead of myself with that bit, but I felt it appropriate to share it where it fit into the story. My grandfather had bladder cancer when I was 13. Medical technology wasn't quite what it is these days, and the doctors didn't really give him a lot of options. He was 82 when he was diagnosed, and due to his taking great care of himself all his life, looked like he was only 50. That year was really hard on him, but by the end of it he had beaten cancer. The fact that within 2 years of this, he started to look gaunt and skeletal and have a bad odor to him was always attributed to the cancer. The cancer he had almost immediately beaten and come out the other side of completely fine. My grandfather began to act strangely right around this point when I was 15. He had always been the most pleasant, peaceful man I had ever known. He taught lessons of grace, repose, and forgiveness. I had never heard him raise his voice or swear or say anything even remotely mean. He began to withdraw into himself and speak in a raspier voice than he'd ever had about things that made no sense. Now I know what dementia is. I've seen it firsthand plenty of times back when I dated a girl who worked in a nursing home, and later when my sister worked in one. I've been along for a few strange adventures in babysitting, so to say. This was different. He became the meanest man I knew, and it wasn't something he didn't know he was doing. He was quite lucid. He had always spent a lot of time out in his work shed or walking the woods. He now spent almost all of his time out there. As his body rapidly fell apart on him, we would sometimes find him out there with his walker just staring at the treetops and humming out of key. This is significant as he was a quite talented singer. He knew how to carry a tune. And it wasn't just him behaving strangely. His woods began to act strangely as well. The animals would follow him about. A bear moved into the area when we had seen none before. I saw him once standing in the tree line, and he was talking to a group of wild turkeys about sacrifice. He always stood in that same spot, over by the salt lick that my grandmother used to draw in deer so she could look at them while she sang in German in the kitchen and made dinner. I was maybe 30 feet away. He turned around when he heard me start to go over to him, 'cause turkeys can really mess you up, believe it or not. He had this look to him that was all wrong, like his lips and the end of his nose were way too far over on his face. He saw the look I gave that, blinking to try and make it go back to rights, and used a hand to fix it. He smiled, walked past me, and patted my shoulder as he went by. He disappeared into the house, looking over his shoulder at me with a smile as he did so. I looked back and the turkeys were gone. I just realized I worded that like the bear was talking. My bad. It was my grandfather I was talking about. Oops, spooky-ass talking bears. Now this is where the timeline begins to go wobbly. My family all say conflicting things about when my grandfather died, and about how long it took my grandmother to tell us or bring his ashes home. Not even my grandmother answers the question consistently. I'll never forget the day my brothers and I found out. We came home from school. It was a Friday, and I was excited to be home for the weekend. My mother had left a note on the counter that simply said, "Opa dead in the AM, massive stroke, back at 6. My mom has always had trouble being sensitive to other people's feelings. My mom says she didn't write that note. My mom now sticks to her guns that he's been dead 3 years at that point. My mom now says that my grandmother covered up details. My dad, who cried for the only time I've ever witnessed in my life during his father's funeral, can't pinpoint how long it's been either. He seems to think he died 5 years earlier. My brothers and my sister don't remember the note. My older brother, who wrecked the kitchen in a fit of rage over the note, didn't even seem to remember our grandfather last time I spoke to him. It's like there's a mental block on everybody, and I can't describe it. He comes to me in my dreams some nights, as he's done my entire life, and tells me to let go as he fades into the trees. Maybe he's been dead all along. Dreams are pretty significant in my opinion. Never doubt that your subconscious tries to tell you things. I know that sounds like the end, but it isn't. I asked my grandmother about this when the details started to get muddy in everyone's minds. She sat me down with a cup of coffee in her kitchen and tried to tell me something. Then she forgot what we were doing, seemed to forget I had been there for an hour, and acted surprised to see me. She noticed my coffee and asked if I'd been there long. I told her how long I'd been there and that she was about to say something about Opa. She said she didn't remember any of that and made a joke about getting old. I didn't want to upset her, so I took her to dinner and away from the house. When we got into my car, I spotted a stag in that spot my grandfather always stood, staring at me even as I backed down the long driveway. Sorry, I got a sudden headache and went out for a smoke. It seems that happens to me a lot when I think about him. 8 years ago, I lived in Georgia. I was driving my roommate up to the Waffle House we both worked at in my father's car to get our paychecks. There was a tractor on the side of the road, an old one, and it reminded me of my Opa's tractor. He had a 1938 Ford exactly like the one in this picture. We were only going about 15 miles per hour as the road curved sharply where we were. My roommate said I went blank and got a terrible nosebleed, and we went right off the road. I didn't tell him what was really going on. See, when I try to think about him, it hurts deep in my skull. Every day I remember a little bit less about him. I remembered something that I immediately forgot again, and we went off the road. Nobody was hurt, and the car was fine, so we just went about our day with my roommate driving for us instead. Pictures of him keep disappearing out of our family's little treasure trove of heirlooms, so I stole the last 3 of him from them and framed them up in my living room where they'll be noticed if they disappear. Apparently, I also possess the only copies of certain home movies he appears in, that my father restored and gave copies of to everyone. 5 years ago, my father began to dredge a pond on my grandmother's property. My grandfather had always said he wanted my father to build something on it. He owned 80 acres of undeveloped land, and my father is a master carpenter. My dad bought a bucket crane and kept it on site to dredge with. My brothers and I often accompanied him on the days he would go work on the property. There was a neighbor near that part of the property who had lived there nearly 50 years, who was always sitting on his porch with a shotgun, a PBR, and a pack of filterless Camels. He looked like the old man from Pet Sematary and always made me uncomfortable. We stopped by to ask him how he was and if he'd seen anything interesting going on in the woods lately every time we were there. This one time, he pointed out a plume of smoke back by where we were working. We figured someone had done something to the crane. We hurried back there and the crane was fine. There was a small field and a clearing of trees off to the side, and it was just ash and smoldering plants. Right in the center, there was something white. My older brother and I went to investigate. It was a perfectly intact, bleach-white skeleton of an 8-point buck. Now I know this seems far-fetched even for /X/ standards, but I have a theory. I think something happened to my grandfather out in the woods one day, and something took his place. I really hope I'm wrong, and if I'm not, I really hope that the skeleton in that fire was it, that my grandfather somehow took revenge from beyond. My grandmother always says he's out there in the woods watching over us and talking to the deer. This one was a little bit shorter than the last one. I really hope all of you who were reading along had a good time. I'll be around if anyone has any questions or ideas or just wants to talk about further details. Thanks for indulging my weirdness. Oh, and to reference something I said earlier, about the last time I saw my grandfather. I had already said a little bit, so I almost forgot to elaborate. When I was 13, I was visiting my grandparents in the summertime again. I'd been at their house for over 2 weeks. Earlier in the day, I had walked out to the pond with him. He was oddly quiet for most of the walk, although that had begun to be his norm, so I shouldn't say it was odd. I've always been terribly arachnophobic. There was a large spider web across a part of the path, and I grabbed a stick to get rid of it. My grandfather put a hand on my wrist, gripping it tightly, and said to me, "Oh no, honey, don't destroy it. Everything in the world kills, but only to survive. We're all just surviving." He walked off the path, went around it, and hummed an odd tune. I remember the smell, like rotting meat, suddenly happening, and my grandfather stumbled a bit. I asked if he was all right, and he just said it was time for me to go home and started heading back to the house. I followed. He walked past the porch when I went in and headed over to the tree line. I told my grandmother I wanted to go home, and as we got in the car, he stood over by the salt lick, 2 bucks behind him. I thought he was waving, and I waved back. He held his hand out like he wanted me to stop leaving, and gestured for me to come. I shook my head as we headed around the bend, and the last time I ever saw him, he turned around and headed into the woods, the 2 bucks moving out of his way, then following.
Can you tell me more about your grandfather, or what he told you, if you can remember or whatever? Things he taught you, or maybe warned you about. Did he ever mention what /X/ calls skinwalkers, or Wendigo? I believe they're also called by Native Americans. I'm very interested in this, fake or not, so go wild.
My grandfather was a milk delivery man in the 1930s. He joined the Air Force to fight in World War II after America got involved, despite being half German and half Blackfoot himself. He married my grandmother not long after the war ended. He was very tall, had dark skin, and had gray hair pretty much his entire life. He owned 80 acres of land in Michigan, and he planted a forest by hand on it between the 1940s and 1960s. He loved nature and animals, and was a spiritualist himself, believing in the power of nature rather than any god. But he never really talked about his beliefs, unless you really pressed him. He never yelled or swore at all until those last few years of his life. He liked to drink PBR and smoke Camels, which if you caught the guy I mentioned previously, might have just been the local thing to do. I'm not sure. All of his neighbors that I ever met did the same. He quit smoking in the 90s, but picked it back up 10 years later, although only a couple here and there. My grandmother herself was actually from Germany and lived in Berlin during the war. Only her and one of her 4 brothers survived the war out of her entire family. To elaborate on things my grandfather spoke about since you requested it, he was a staunch believer that every life and every death had purpose, and that they were all essential to the continued harmony and balance of the universe. He spoke about walking through dreams and not just your own, and how powerful they could be. He always said that the animals had a certain order to the way they did things, and for people to say that they were just simple beasts offended him. He liked to work with his hands and was himself a master carpenter, and often spoke about the value of hard work towards enlightenment and grace. And yes, he spoke about some sort of thing that could walk inside a man. I don't know what kind of words he used for it anymore, because apparently skinwalker isn't the right word. Wendigo is a familiar word and could be the right one, but again, I've been lurking here for years, so I don't know if it is the actual word he used or not. He said that he spoke to the animals that lived in his woods and that they told him to be wary of the deer. My grandfather was a very trusting and spiritual man, so he asked the deer themselves whenever he got the chance, which is why he had the salt lick right out in the open up by his house, I'm guessing. He always said it was so Oma could watch them from the kitchen. It apparently wasn't a good idea, if my theory is correct. I wonder if he told me about the deer on purpose or not, because I'm apparently the only one he said a lot of those things to other than my grandmother. Are there stories about similar things mentally erasing their presence, including the person they've inhabited, from people who get too close to the truth's memories and thoughts? Because it took me all day thinking to remember these details, and as I said, people who knew him have just about forgotten he existed until reminded, despite him having been a huge part of all of our lives. I used to post stuff on here, and I recently started lurking once again. I'll share a new story with you because why not? When I was a little boy, I spent my weekends at my granny's house. She had a piano in her dining room which had belonged to her mother. Nobody had known how to play the piano, but my granny and her mother. One night I woke up in the guest bedroom and heard the piano playing. I came out of the bedroom to ask my granny why she was playing that late, and there was nobody there. The lid was open and the keys were moving. It wasn't a self-playing piano. Being a little boy, I screamed. My granny came rushing out of her bedroom and told me to quiet down because I was interrupting her mom's playing and being rude. Years later, I'm over at a friend's house. He was a very good friend of the whole family, and he sits down at his piano. He was a very talented musician. He asked me, as I had told him the story, if I remembered the music. I told him I did. He started playing, and I started crying. It was the same song. He told me his grandmother, who I was very fond of, had died the previous day, and that she had visited him in a dream and told him that Pearl, my great-grandmother's name, which I'm not sure he actually knew, wanted him to play that song for me. I know, it isn't creepy at all, it's actually really sweet. Oh well.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.